It was a cool Friday evening in Los Angeles, the kind where the sky turns soft orange just before sunset, and the city seems to slow down for a breath. Inside the HBO studios, the energy was anything but calm. Crew members darted between cameras, adjusting lights and checking microphones. The audience, mostly young, mostly curious, settled into their seats, buzzing with anticipation. They weren't here for another politician or a trending influencer. Tonight's guest was different. He didn't post daily on social media. He rarely gave interviews. But when he did show up, people listened. Keanu Reeves had agreed to appear on Real Time with Bill Maher, and that alone felt like an event. Not because he was promoting a blockbuster. He was, technically. But because Keanu wasn't the kind of celebrity who used talk shows as billboards. He showed up when he felt it mattered. Or maybe, as some guessed, when he simply felt like having a real conversation. Backstage, he sat quietly in a small green room, sipping water from a paper cup. No entourage, no publicist hovering, just him in a dark sweater, looking more like someone waiting for a bus than a Hollywood icon with decades of fame behind him. He'd been through a lot, more than most people could imagine. The kind of losses that hollow you out, yet there he was, calm, present, ready to walk onto a stage hosted by one of the most famously skeptical voices in America. Bill Maher, for his part, had been looking forward to this. He respected Keanu, not just as an actor but as someone who seemed to move through life with a strange kind of grace. Still, Maher couldn't resist a little provocation. That was his brand, after all. He'd built a career on challenging beliefs, especially religious ones. And he'd heard rumors, little snippets from past interviews where Keanu had spoken about Jesus in a way that wasn't ironic or dismissive. That alone was unusual in Hollywood, where faith was often treated like an embarrassing family heirloom you kept hidden in the attic. As the show's intro music began and the red, on-air lights flickered on, the audience clapped with genuine excitement. Bill walked out with his usual swagger, cracked a joke about California traffic, and then turned to the guest chair. "Ladies and gentlemen, Keanu Reeves," he said, and the applause swelled. Keanu stood, gave a small wave, and sat down with that familiar half-smile, the one that seemed to say, "I'm glad to be here, but I'm not sure why you're all so excited about me." The first few minutes were easy. They talked about the new movie, some sci-fi thriller with robots and moral dilemmas. Keanu answered thoughtfully, never overselling it, never pretending it was more than it was. Bill teased him gently about still doing his own stunts at his age. Keanu laughed, shrugged, and said something like, "If I stop moving, I might rust." The audience chuckled. It felt warm, human. But Bill had a plan. He always did. After a commercial break, they returned to the stage, and Bill leaned forward in his chair. "So," he began, his tone shifting just slightly, still friendly but with that familiar edge creeping in. "I've got to ask you something that's been on my mind." He paused for effect. "You've said in interviews that you believe in Jesus, like, actually believe. Not just as a historical figure, but as, what, a savior? A miracle worker? The whole thing?" The room didn't go silent, but the energy changed. People shifted in their seats. Some glanced at each other. This wasn't the usual celebrity fluff. Keanu didn't flinch. He just looked at Bill, calm as ever. "I've said I find meaning in the story of Jesus," he replied carefully. Bill raised his eyebrows, a playful smirk forming. "The story? Or the reality? Because let's be honest, walking on water, rising from the dead. In 2023, you're one of the most grounded people I've ever met. How do you square that?" A few nervous laughs rippled through the audience. It was classic Maher, sharp, skeptical, a little cheeky. He wasn't being cruel, but he was clearly setting up for a punchline. He leaned back, arms crossed, waiting. Keanu took a breath. He didn't look offended. He didn't look defensive. If anything, he looked thoughtful, like someone who'd asked himself the same question 1,000 times. But before he could answer, Bill added almost as an afterthought, "I mean, if you told me you believed in unicorns, I'd honestly be less surprised." That got a bigger laugh. Even the crew off camera chuckled. It was funny, because it was absurd, and because it came from Bill, who'd made a career out of calling out absurdity wherever he saw it, especially in religion. Keanu just nodded slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He let the laughter fade on its own. And in that quiet moment, something shifted. The audience stopped waiting for a joke. They started waiting for an answer. Because here was the thing about Keanu Reeves. He didn't perform. He didn't give canned responses. When he spoke, it always felt like he meant it. And right now, in front of millions of potential viewers, under the hot studio lights with one of the most famous skeptics in America staring at him expectantly, he wasn't going to dodge the question. He looked down for a second, as if gathering his thoughts, then met Bill's eyes again. "I don't know if I believe in miracles the way you think I do," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough that every word carried. The room got quieter. Even Bill seemed to sit up a little straighter, and that's when it happened, the moment no one saw coming. Not the audience. Not the crew. Maybe not even Bill himself. Keanu wasn't about to argue theology. He wasn't going to quote scripture or defend dogma. Instead, he was going to talk about something far more personal, something raw, real, and deeply human. Something that had nothing to do with walking on water, and everything to do with staying afloat when life tries to pull you under. But that would come in a moment. For now, the silence stretched, thick, respectful, full of unspoken weight. The kind of silence that only happens when someone is about to say something true. Outside, the LA night deepened. Inside, the cameras kept rolling. And somewhere between skepticism and sincerity, between mockery and meaning, a conversation was about to begin that would leave everyone in the room. And later, millions watching at home, thinking long after the credits rolled, because sometimes, the most powerful moments don't start with a shout. They start with a pause, a breath, and the courage to speak honestly in a world that often rewards noise over nuance. And Keanu Reeves, in his quiet way, was about to prove that once again. Bill leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, that familiar glint in his eye, the one that said he was about to press a little harder, not to be mean, but because he genuinely couldn't wrap his head around it. "Okay," he said, voice softer now but still edged with curiosity. "So you don't believe in miracles like magic tricks, but you still believe in Jesus? Like, as real? As someone who actually did what the Bible says?" He wasn't shouting. He wasn't mocking, not exactly. But there was a kind of gentle disbelief in his tone. The kind people use when they're trying to understand something that feels completely foreign to them. And to Bill, faith, especially the kind that involved resurrection and divine love, was like trying to read a book written in a language he'd never studied. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands for a moment, fingers loosely clasped. The studio lights caught the faint lines on his face, lines that hadn't been there 20 years ago. Lines carved by time, yes, but also by grief, by loss, by nights spent wondering how to keep going when everything you love slips through your fingers like sand. "I don't claim to understand it all," he finally said, voice low but steady. "I'm not a theologian. I don't go to church every Sunday. I don't have all the answers." He paused, then added, "But I've seen enough pain in this world to know that we need something to hold on to." Bill nodded slowly, but his expression said he wasn't fully convinced. "I get that," he said. "People want comfort, I get it. But comfort isn't truth. Believing something because it makes you feel better doesn't make it real. That's like believing your dead dog is waiting for you in dog heaven, just because it hurts too much to think otherwise." A few people in the audience shifted. It was a fair point. Bill's whole thing was about truth, even when it stung. He'd built his career on calling out wishful thinking, whether it was about religion, politics, or wellness gurus selling magic crystals. Keanu listened without interrupting. When Bill finished, he didn't argue. He just said, "Maybe it's not about what's real in the way we measure things. Maybe it's about what helps us be better." Bill raised an eyebrow. "Better how?" "Kinder," Keanu said simply. "More patient. More willing to help someone even when it costs you something." Now Bill leaned back, arms crossed. "But you don't need Jesus for that. You can be a good person without believing in a sky wizard who watches your every move. In fact, some of the worst things in human history were done in the name of that sky wizard." He wasn't wrong, and Keanu didn't try to deny it. "I know," he said quietly. "I've read the history. I've seen the harm religion can do when it's used to control people or justify cruelty." He looked directly at Bill now. "But I've also seen what happens when people have nothing to believe in, when they think life is just random and pain has no meaning, and kindness is just weakness." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was a weight behind his words that made the room feel smaller, like the walls had moved in to listen. Bill opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. For a second, he looked like he was actually thinking, not performing, not setting up a joke, just thinking. Then he said, "So you're not saying Jesus literally rose from the dead?" Keanu shook his head slightly. "I don't know, maybe not. That's not really the point for me." "Then what is the point?" Bill asked, genuinely puzzled now. "The point," Keanu said, "is that someone chose love over revenge. Someone forgave the people who hurt him. Someone said how I'd take care of each other and meant it, even when it got him killed." He paused. "That idea, it matters, whether it happened exactly like the story says or not. The idea is real, and it changes people." Bill was quiet for a beat. Then with a half smile, he said, "You're making it sound less like religion and more like a moral compass." "Maybe it is," Keanu replied. "For me, anyway." The audience was completely still. No coughing. No shuffling. Just silence, the kind that comes when people realize they're witnessing something rare. Not a debate, not a performance, but two very different people trying to understand each other. Bill rubbed his chin. "But here's the thing," he said after a moment. "If you strip away all the miracles, all the supernatural stuff, all the God's plan talk, aren't you just left with a really nice philosophy? Why call it Jesus at all? Why not just say, be kind and leave it at that?" Keanu thought about that. He looked out at the audience for a second, as if searching for the right words among all those faces. Then he said, "Because stories stick. A philosophy is an idea, but a story lives in you. When I think about someone who gave everything, not for power, not for fame, but for others, it gives me a picture. A person to look up to. Not perfect, not magical, just deeply human in the best possible way." He didn't say it like a sermon. He said it like someone sharing a secret that had helped him survive. Bill exhaled slowly. "You know," he said, "most people, when I challenge their faith, they either get angry or start quoting scripture at me. You're the first person who's talked about it like it's personal, like it's not about proving something, but about getting through the day." Keanu gave a small nod. "It is personal," he said. "It's not about convincing anyone else. It's about what helps me stay connected. To other people, to hope, to the part of myself that still believes good things are possible." At that moment, a stagehand off to the side accidentally knocked over a mic stand. The soft clang broke the spell, but instead of annoyance, people smiled. It was a reminder that they were still in a TV studio, still in the real world where things are messy and imperfect. Bill chuckled. "Well," he said, "I didn't expect to get schooled in compassion by an action movie star." Keanu smiled faintly. "I'm not schooling anyone. I'm just telling you what's true for me." And that was the thing. He wasn't trying to convert anyone. He wasn't defending a doctrine. He was just being honest about what kept him going when the world felt dark. Bill leaned back in his chair, his usual sarcasm softened by something that looked a lot like respect. "You know," he said, "I still don't believe in any of it. But I believe that it means something to you, and that I can respect." The audience let out a quiet, collective breath. No applause, just a sense of relief, like they'd been holding tension they didn't even know they had. But then Bill, ever the provocateur, couldn't resist one last jab, though this time it came with a wink. "Still," he said, "if you ever see Jesus walking on water, send me a video. I'll believe it when I see it." Keanu laughed. Actually laughed, and the sound was warm, genuine. "I'll keep my phone ready," he said. And just like that, the moment passed. The tension dissolved, but something had shifted. Not because minds were changed, but because two people with wildly different views had spoken to each other like human beings. Not as symbols, not as enemies, but as people trying to make sense of a confusing world. Backstage, the producer glanced at the clock. They were running long, but no one cared. This wasn't just another segment. This was the kind of conversation people would talk about later. In cars, at dinner tables, in late-night texts to friends. Because in a time when everything felt polarized, when every discussion seemed to turn into a fight, here was something rare, honesty without arrogance, doubt without dismissal, and a quiet reminder that belief, real belief, doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. And as the camera held on Keanu's calm face, eyes steady and kind, it was clear he hadn't come to win an argument. He'd come to share a piece of his heart, and in doing so, he'd done something even Bill Maher hadn't expected. He'd made room for grace right there, in the middle of a late-night talk show. The studio lights hummed softly overhead, casting a warm glow that did little to ease the quiet tension hanging in the air. Bill had just made his last joke, about sending a video if Jesus ever walked on water. And Keanu had laughed, but the laughter didn't land like a punchline. It landed like a bridge. And now, in the space between jokes and truth, something deeper was rising to the surface. Bill shifted in his chair, his usual restless energy slowing down. He glanced at the audience, then back at Keanu. There was a question in his eyes, not the kind he asked to score points, but the kind that comes when you've been listening and something doesn't quite add up. "You keep saying it helps you," he said slowly. "But help with what exactly?" "I mean, life is hard for everyone. We all lose people. We all face pain. Why does believing in Jesus make that easier for you?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands again, turning his wedding bandless finger absently as if tracing memories only he could see. The silence stretched just long enough that the audience stopped fidgeting. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Then he spoke, voice quieter than before, like he was sharing something he didn't often put into words. "It's not that it makes it easier," he said. "It doesn't. Nothing makes losing someone you love easy. Nothing takes away that hole inside you." He paused, swallowed. "But it gives me a way to carry it." Bill tilted his head slightly, listening. "When my daughter died," Keanu began, and the room seemed to shrink. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. The tragedy had been years ago, but grief doesn't run on a clock. I didn't understand how to keep going. I felt like the world had gone silent, like nothing mattered anymore. He looked up, not at Bill, but past him as if seeing something far away. But then I remembered something someone once told me about how Jesus wept. Not when he was being crucified, not when he was betrayed, but when his friend Lazarus died. He stood at the tomb and cried. Even though he knew he was about to bring him back to life, he still cried. Keanu's voice cracked just a little. He didn't hide it. That meant something to me. It meant that sadness isn't weakness, that love and loss go together, and that even if you believe in something bigger, you're still allowed to hurt. Bill didn't interrupt. He just sat there, his usual smirk gone, replaced by something softer, something that looked a lot like understanding. "I don't believe Jesus was God," Keanu continued, "but I believe he showed us what it looks like to love without conditions, to care for the people no one else sees, to stand with the broken instead of walking away." He looked at Bill now, eyes clear and steady. "When I'm at my lowest, that's what I hold on to. Not a miracle, but a choice. The choice to be kind even when it doesn't make sense, even when it hurts." A woman in the front row wiped her eyes quickly, pretending to adjust her glasses. A man near the back nodded slowly, like he'd heard something he'd been trying to say for years but never found the words for. Bill leaned forward again, but this time there was no edge in his voice. "So it's not about heaven or hell? Not about being saved?" Keanu shook his head. "For me, it's about right now, about how I treat the person in front of me, about whether I choose hope or despair when things fall apart." He gave a small, sad smile. "I've been through enough to know that despair is easy. Hope takes work." Bill was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "You know, I've spent my whole career tearing down religious dogma, and I still think a lot of it is nonsense. But what you're describing, that doesn't sound like dogma. That sounds like humanity." Keanu nodded. Maybe that's what it was always supposed to be. The audience didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They just sat there still and present, as if they'd stumbled into a private conversation they weren't meant to hear, but were glad they did. Bill rubbed his temple, like he was trying to rearrange his thoughts. "I guess what surprises me," he said finally, "is that you're not defensive. Most people, when I question their faith, they shut down or get angry. But you just talk about it like it's part of your story, like it's real, but not something you're trying to shove down anyone else's throat." "That's because it's not about convincing anyone," Keanu said gently. "It's about staying connected. To something bigger than myself, yes, but also to other people. When I help someone, when I listen, when I show up, that's where I feel closest to whatever God is. Not in a building, not in a book, in the doing." Bill let out a soft laugh, not mocking but amazed. "You've turned religion into Action. Maybe it always was, Keanu replied. And in that moment something shifted. Not just in the room, but in the way the whole conversation was being seen. This wasn't atheist versus believer. It wasn't logic versus faith. It was two people talking about what it means to be human in a world that often feels cold and chaotic. Bill glanced at the clock off stage. They were well over time, but no one was rushing them. The producers knew this was the kind of moment that didn't come often. Raw, unplanned, real. He turned back to Keanu. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," Keanu said. "Do you pray?" Keanu thought about it. "Not like most people think of prayer. I don't ask for things. I don't bargain. But sometimes, I just sit quietly and say thank you. For the people who've loved me. For the moments of peace. For the chance to try again tomorrow." He looked down again, then back up. "And sometimes when it's really bad, I just say, I don't know what to do, and that's enough." Bill was silent for a long time. Then he said, voice softer than it had been all night, "That's not so different from what I do, except I say it to the universe instead of to Jesus." Keanu smiled. Maybe the universe is listening either way. A few people in the audience smiled too. Not because it was funny, but because it felt true in a way that didn't need proof. The red on-air light stayed on, but the show had stopped feeling like a show. It felt like a late-night talk between friends who didn't agree on everything, but respected each other enough to listen. And in a world where so many conversations end in shouting, that felt revolutionary, Keanu didn't preach. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't claim to have the answers. He just shared how he got through the dark, and in doing so gave others permission to admit they were in the dark too. Bill, for once, didn't have a comeback. He just nodded, like he'd been handed something precious and wasn't sure how to hold it. And the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of respect, full of shared humanity, full of the unspoken truth that sometimes the deepest beliefs aren't shouted, they're whispered, in the quiet moments when we're honest about how much we need each other. Outside, the city kept moving, cars honking, phones buzzing, lives rushing forward. But inside that studio, time had slowed. And in that slowness, something rare had happened. Two very different people had found common ground, not in what they believed, but in why they kept trying to believe in anything at all. And that, more than any miracle, felt like grace. The silence in the studio didn't feel empty. It felt full, like the air itself was holding its breath. Bill sat back slowly, his usual restless energy replaced by something quieter, something closer to wonder. He'd come into this conversation ready to challenge, to poke, to expose what he saw as the soft underbelly of blind faith. But instead of dogma, he'd found depth. Instead of certainty, he'd found humility. And instead of a celebrity giving rehearsed answers, he'd gotten honesty, raw, unpolished, and real. He cleared his throat, not to fill the quiet, but to steady himself. "You know," he said, voice lower now, almost gentle, "I've interviewed a lot of people who talk about God. Preachers, politicians, even a few actors. Most of them sound like they're selling something, but you sound like you're just trying to survive." Keanu didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Maybe that's all any of us are doing," he said. "Surviving, and hoping we can do it without losing our kindness along the way." Bill nodded slowly. He glanced at the audience, then back. "I keep thinking about what you said about Jesus weeping. I never really paid attention to that part before. I always focused on the miracles, the walking on water, the rising from the dead. But you're right. The crying matters more." "It shows he was human," Keanu said. "And if he was human, then maybe the love he showed is something we can actually do, not because we're saints, but because we're people." Bill let that sink in. Then, with a small shake of his head, he said, "I still don't believe in a divine plan. I think the universe is indifferent, but I do believe in people choosing to care. And maybe that's enough." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Maybe it's more than enough. Maybe that's everything." A few people in the audience exchanged glances, not in disbelief, but in recognition, as if they'd just heard something they'd always felt but never heard said out loud. Bill rubbed his hands together, the way someone does when they're trying to warm themselves, not from cold, but from uncertainty. "Here's what I don't get," he said carefully. "If your version of faith is just about kindness and compassion, why call it Jesus at all? Why not just say be good and leave the rest behind?" Keanu thought for a moment. Outside, a distant siren wailed, a reminder that life kept moving even while they sat in this bubble of conversation. Because stories give us shape, he finally said. Ideas are important, but they float. A story anchors them. When I think of someone who fed the hungry, who touched the untouchable, who forgave the people who hurt him most, that's not just an idea. That's a person, and people stay with you. He paused, then added, My mom used to read me Bible stories when I was little. Not because she was super religious, she wasn't, but because she liked the lessons in them. She'd say, this part's probably not true, but this part is worth remembering. And the part she always pointed to was the one where someone helps a stranger on the road, even though they're from a different tribe, a different place. She called that the heart of it. Bill smiled faintly. The Good Samaritan. Keanu nodded. Yeah, that one. She'd say, if you do that, if you help someone just because they need it, that's enough religion for a lifetime. Bill was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I've spent years arguing that religion divides people, and it often does. But what you're describing, that's the opposite. That's connection. Maybe the problem isn't the story, Keanu said gently. Maybe it's how we use it. We can use it to shut people out, or to invite them in. Bill exhaled long and slow. I think I've been so focused on tearing down the walls that I forgot some people use those same walls to find shelter. Keanu didn't say anything. He just looked at him, and in that look was no judgment, only understanding, and that more than anything seemed to catch Bill off guard. He wasn't used to being met with grace when he came in swinging. He'd expected resistance, maybe even anger. Instead, he'd been handed patience. He leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, like a student now instead of a debater. Do you ever doubt? He asked. Really doubt? Like in the middle of the night when everything feels pointless. Do you ever wonder if it's all just nothing? Keanu didn't hesitate. All the time. That answer seemed to surprise Bill. You do? Of course, Keanu said. Doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's part of it. If you never doubt, you're not really thinking. And if you're not thinking, you're just repeating. He looked out at the audience not to perform, but to include them. I think faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about staying open to the questions. It's about saying, I don't know, but I'm still trying to be kind anyway. Bill let out a quiet laugh. That's actually beautiful. It's just honest, Keanu replied. And in that honesty, something shifted in the room. The divide between believer and skeptic didn't disappear, but it softened. It became less of a wall and more of a shared path, where both could walk side by side, even if they saw the scenery differently. Bill glanced off stage, where a producer gave him a subtle signal. They were running long, but no one wanted to cut this short. He turned back to Keanu. Can I tell you something strange? He asked. Sure. I've never felt less like arguing with someone who believes in God than I do right now. Keanu smiled, a real one this time, small but warm. Maybe that's because I'm not asking you to believe what I believe. I'm just telling you what helps me stay human. And that, Bill said, is something even a skeptic can respect. The audience stirred slightly, not with applause, but with a collective sense of relief, as if they'd been holding their breath through a storm and finally saw clear sky. Bill sat back. His posture relaxed in a way it rarely was. I used to think people who believed in Jesus were either naive or brainwashed. But talking to you, it's like I've been looking at a painting from the wrong angle this whole time. I only saw the frame, the rules, the rituals, the institutions, but I missed the picture inside. Keanu nodded. The picture is messy. It's full of contradictions, but it's also full of love. And love, Bill said slowly, isn't irrational. It's just hard to measure. Maybe that's why it matters, Keanu said. They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Like two travelers who'd argued over the map but finally agreed on the direction. Then Bill did something unexpected. He reached out and gently tapped Keanu's knee just once, a small gesture of connection. Thank you, he said, and he meant it. Keanu nodded. Thank you for listening. And in that simple exchange, something rare happened on live television. No winner, no loser. Just two people who'd met each other where they were. Without armor, without agenda. The red on-air light still glowed, but the show had become something else entirely. Not entertainment, not debate, Just two humans trying to understand what it means to live with heart in a world that often rewards hardness. And as the camera held on their faces, Bill's thoughtful, Keanu's calm, the audience didn't need a punchline or a dramatic ending. They'd already gotten something better, a reminder that even in disagreement there can be dignity. Even in doubt there can be hope. And even in a late-night studio, under bright lights and ticking clocks there can be moments of real, unscripted grace. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to convince someone you're right, but to show them you see them. And in that seeing, everything changes. The show ended not with a bang but with a quiet nod. Bill didn't wrap things up with his usual sharp commentary or a sarcastic zinger. He just turned to the camera and said, "We'll be right back," his voice softer than it had been all night. The audience didn't leap to their feet in applause. They sat for a moment still, as if waking from a dream they didn't want to forget. Then slowly they began to clap, not out of habit but out of gratitude. Backstage, the usual post-show chaos was absent. Crew members moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Someone whispered, "That was different." Another nodded, eyes a little glassy. Even the stagehands, who'd seen hundreds of guests come and go, lingered near the wings as if hoping to catch one more word. Keanu stood up, thanked Bill with a handshake that lasted a beat longer than usual, and walked off without fanfare. No entourage, no phone calls. Just him, his sweater, and the weight of a conversation that had gone deeper than anyone expected. Bill stayed seated for a moment, staring at the empty chair beside him. His producer approached holding a tablet. "That segment's already blowing up online," he said, voice low. "People are sharing clips. Not the jokes, the quiet parts." Bill nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I felt it too." He didn't say much more. But later that night, long after the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed out into the cool LA air, he sat alone in his office, replaying the tape. Not to check for mistakes, but to listen again, to really hear what had been said. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to argue. He just felt moved. By the next morning, the internet was alive with the moment. Not because of a viral insult or a heated clash, but because of something far rarer. A conversation where two people disagreed but still treated each other like human beings. Clips of Keanu talking about grief, about kindness, about Jesus as a symbol of love, not doctrine, spread across social media. People who rarely agreed on anything found themselves quoting the same lines. One video showed a young man watching the segment on his phone during a bus ride, tears quietly streaming down his face. Another showed a group of friends in a coffee shop, pausing their conversation to watch it together, then sitting in silence for a full minute after it ended. A pastor shared it with his congregation, not to prove a point but to remind them that faith isn't about being right. It's about being present. An atheist blogger wrote a long post titled, "What if kindness is enough?" Even people who didn't believe in God found something in it. Because it wasn't really about religion. It was about what happens when you stop trying to win and start trying to understand. Bill noticed it too. His inbox filled with messages, not angry rants or fan mail, but notes from strangers saying things like, "Thank you for letting him speak," or, "I lost my brother last year, and what he said made me feel less alone." One simply read, "You both reminded me that it's okay to not have answers." A week later on his podcast, Bill brought it up again. "I went into that interview thinking I'd poke holes in fairy tales," he admitted. "But instead I met someone who wasn't selling a story. He was living one. And his story wasn't about miracles in the sky. It was about showing up for people here on the ground." He paused, then added, "Maybe that's the only miracle we need." He didn't suddenly become religious. He still questioned, still challenged, still called out hypocrisy when he saw it. But something had shifted in how he framed those conversations. He started asking, "What does this belief do for you?" Instead of, "Why do you believe that nonsense?" It was a small change, but it made a big difference. As for Keanu, he didn't give interviews about it. He didn't post about it online. He just went back to his life, visiting hospitals quietly, tipping generously, stopping to talk to fans who looked like they were having a hard day. When reporters asked him about their real-time appearance, he'd just say, "It was a good conversation," and change the subject. But those who knew him noticed something. He seemed lighter, not because he'd won anything, but because he'd been heard. Not as a movie star, not as a meme, but as a person carrying grief, hope, and questions just like everyone else. Months later, at a film festival in Toronto, someone asked him if he regretted talking about faith on live TV. He thought for a moment, then said, "I don't regret speaking from the heart. If it helped even one person feel less alone, then it was worth it." And that was the thing. No one walked away from that night thinking they had to believe what Keanu believed. But many walked away feeling like it was okay to believe something. Okay to doubt. Okay to hurt. Okay to choose kindness even when the world feels cruel. In a time when public discourse often felt like a battlefield, where every opinion had to be defended like a fortress, where nuance was weakness and compromise was betrayal, that conversation became a quiet rebellion. Not against reason, not against science, but against the idea that we have to be hard to be strong. School teachers played the clip in ethics classes. Counselors referenced it in grief support groups. Parents showed it to their teenagers and said, "This is how you talk to someone you disagree with." And somewhere, in living rooms and dorm rooms and late-night drives, people watched it and felt a little less alone in their searching. Because the truth is, most of us aren't looking for perfect answers. We're looking for proof that it's okay to keep asking, that it's okay to not have it all figured out, that it's okay to believe in love, even if you're not sure where it comes from. Years from now, people might not remember the movie Keanu was promoting that night. They might not remember the exact words Bill used, but they'll remember how it felt to watch two very different people sit in the same room and treat each other with dignity. And in a world that often rewards noise, outrage, and certainty, that kind of quiet courage, that willingness to be vulnerable, to listen, to say, "I don't know, but I'm trying," might be the most radical thing of all. The cameras stopped rolling that night, but the conversation didn't end. It kept going, in homes, in hearts, and small acts of kindness inspired by a few honest minutes on a talk show. Because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't loud. They don't need fireworks or headlines. They just need two people willing to be real. And in that realness, something beautiful happens. We remember that beneath all our beliefs, our doubts, our labels, we're all just trying to find our way through the dark. Together, there was no part 6 planned. The story was meant to end where it did, with quiet ripples spreading from a single honest conversation. But life, as it often does, kept going, and sometimes the echoes of a moment grow louder long after the cameras stop rolling. A year after that night on Real Time, something unexpected happened. Not in Hollywood, not in a studio, but in a small community center in Ohio. A group of people, some religious, some not, some still figuring it out, started meeting once a month. They called it the Listening Circle. No agenda, no debates, just a space where anyone could say, "This is hard," or "I don't know what to believe," and be met with silence that wasn't judgment, but presence. The idea had come from a high school teacher who'd shown her students the clip of Keanu and Bill. One of her students, a quiet kid who rarely spoke in class, stayed after school that day. "I didn't know it was okay to believe in something and still have doubts," he said. That sentence stuck with her. And so she reached out to a local pastor, an atheist philosophy professor, and a grief counselor. They all said yes, not because they agreed, but because they all knew what it felt like to sit in the dark and wonder if anyone else was there. Word spread. Not through ads or social media campaigns, but through whispers. "You should come." No one tries to fix you, they just listen. Meanwhile, Bill began ending his show differently. Instead of closing with a fiery rant, he'd sometimes say, "Before we go, be kind to someone today, even if you don't understand them." Especially then, it wasn't a grand shift, just a small, steady change like a river slowly carving a new path. Keanu, as always, stayed out of the spotlight. But people noticed things. A fan posted a photo online, grainy, taken from across the street, of him sitting on a bench with a homeless man, sharing a coffee, talking like old friends. No bodyguards, no cameras, just two people side by side. The caption read, "He didn't give him money. He gave him time." That photo got shared more than most movie premieres. Back in Los Angeles, a young woman working the night shift at a crisis hotline said that after that interview aired, more callers started saying things like, "I'm not sure I believe in God, but I believe in kindness. Is that enough?" And the answer, more often than not, was yes, it's more than enough. No one claimed the conversation solved anything. Faith and doubt still wrestled in millions of hearts. People still argued online. Churches still split over doctrine. Politicians still used religion as a weapon. The world didn't magically become gentler, but something subtle shifted in the air, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. People began asking different questions. Not are you one of us or one of them, but what's this like for you? At a university in Texas, a philosophy class held a mock debate on faith and reason, but instead of scoring points, the students were asked to end their arguments by saying one thing they respected about the other side. One student, an outspoken atheist, turned to his religious classmate and said, "I respect that your belief makes you show up for people. I wish my doubt did that for me." The room fell silent. Then someone started clapping. Not out of politeness, but out of relief. Even in places far from cameras or headlines, the ripple touched lives. A father in Minnesota, grieving the loss of his son, watched the interview late one night. He'd stopped going to church after the funeral. Too much talk about God's plan, too much empty comfort. But when Keanu said, "I don't know what to do," and called that enough, the father cried for the first time in months. Not because he suddenly believed again, but because he felt permission to not have answers. He started volunteering at a shelter the next week. Not for God, not for redemption, just because someone once said that love is something you do, not just something you feel, and that became his prayer. Bill never interviewed Keanu again. But once, during a live Q&A, someone asked if he'd ever changed his mind about something because of a guest. He paused, then said, "Yeah, I used to think faith was about certainty. Now I think it's about courage. The courage to care when it's easier not to." He didn't mention Keanu by name. He didn't need to. Years later, at a film festival in Europe, a journalist asked Keanu if he ever worried that talking about Jesus would alienate fans or hurt his career. He smiled faintly. "I'm not here to be liked," he said. "I'm here to be honest. And if my honesty helps someone feel less alone, then I've done my job, whether I'm acting or just sitting in a chair talking." The journalist wrote the quote down, but what stayed with her wasn't the words, it was the way he said them. Like it wasn't a performance, like it was just true. Back home, a teenager struggling with anxiety saved a clip of that interview on her phone. She'd play it when the world felt too loud. Not because it gave her answers, but because it reminded her that even someone admired by millions still didn't have it all figured out. And that was okay. In the end, the power of that night wasn't in who was right or wrong. It was in the space they made between them, a space where doubt and faith could sit side by side without fighting, where grief and hope could share the same breath, where two very different people showed the world that you don't have to agree to respect each other, you just have to listen. And maybe in a time when so many voices shout to be heard, the bravest thing anyone can do is to lean in and say, "Tell me more." The story didn't need a part 6, but life wrote one anyway. In coffee shops, in classrooms, in quiet acts of courage that no camera caught. In the way a stranger held a door a second longer. In the way someone said, "I'm sorry you're hurting," instead of, "Everything happens for a reason." Because real change doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it starts with a pause, a breath, a moment of honesty on a late-night show, and then it spreads, not through speeches but through small choices to be kind, to listen, to stay open. And in those choices, over and over again, the world becomes a little more human, not perfect, not fixed, but softer, and sometimes that's enough.